Welcome to UnityNow, the podcast where we discuss unity in the face of division. Inspired by the Unity 2020 plan, we strive to unite Americans by highlighting the middle ground between the two dominant parties and promoting the individual over groups. Each episode, we will bring you exciting, well-informed guests and host nuanced conversations about politically charged subjects. Our goal is to bring an end to the ideological war threatening the collective well-being of this great country.
Please welcome Eric Bronner, founder and COO of Veterans for Political Innovation. Welcome, Eric, to the UnityNow podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Toby.
Yeah, we're pleased to have you on the program today, and I have to do a better job of this whenever I see a veteran. So thank you for your service. We all appreciate that.
Of course,
and
it was a great privilege.
Yeah, we like to hear more about that and your background. Of course, we give the audience kind of that pre-introduction to our guest, but if you could go ahead and add some of that additional background and kind of the story of what led to the creation of the Veterans for Political Innovation.
Yeah, sure. And so, Veterans for Political Innovation, we are mobilizing some of America's most trusted messengers from across the country, across the political spectrum, to focus on three powerful reforms that we think will make politics less toxic and our government more accountable to everyone. But so the cliff notes of my path to get here, I was that strange kid growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who would watch political conventions from beginning to end. And I caught the bug at a young age. Maybe it's narcissism. I hope to be up on that stage one day giving a speech, maybe running for office. One really big problem is I have never identified with either of our two major parties. I've never affiliated with either party. I've never joined either party. And as it turns out, close to 50% of veterans are like me. So, I think a lot of people have gone on some kind of political journey in their life, right, where they maybe move on the spectrum of conservative and liberal and different issues. And like so many Americans, I found myself somewhere in the middle, politically homeless, wanting to engage, but everyone telling me, well, Eric, you have to pick a team. If you want to do something in politics, you have to pick a team.
Right.
And there's just something in me as a fierce independent, maybe too stubborn. I'm not going to be forced to join a private gain-seeking organization unless I fully agree with what they're doing, and I don't, right? So I skipped a lot, but I mean, there was, went to the Naval Academy, graduated in 1997, and flew planes on and off of the USS George Washington in the E-2C Hawkeye. I was a flight officer in the back, and then after getting out, moved to Missouri in 2005 to St. Louis, and went to law school, practiced law for about 2 minutes, did real estate for about 7 minutes. And then if I'm being really honest, a little bit of a midlife crisis. I have a beautiful wife, 3 beautiful kids. Why am I not happier? And I was missing that sense of mission and purpose I'd experienced in the military, wanted to engage in politics, didn't know how. And about that time, I heard a podcast, the fall of 2018 on Freakonomics Radio, called America's Hidden Duopoly. And it was so compelling that I said, I don't know who's doing this work in Missouri, but I'm going to join them. And this is my life calling, and this is a mission that I'm going to be on probably for the rest of my life.
Wow. And then I think it's around 2021. Is that correct, when VPI was created as an organization?
Yeah, exactly right. So Veterans for Political Innovation, we formed with 2 veteran co-founders, Todd Connor and Dan Biga. Todd's the past founder of Bunker Labs, which is a national veteran service organization that helps anyone who's military connected start new businesses. Dan Biga had worked with for a cross-partisan PAC called With Honor. And we found each other. I found Dan through LinkedIn, and Dan was working with Todd at the time, and we were all very, very concerned about the direction of our country, wanting to do something. And by that time in 2021, I had been working with Show Me Integrity in Missouri for almost 3 years. Show Me Integrity is a cross-partisan political reform organization. We helped pass some really cool, innovative voting systems in St. Louis City and some other reforms. And it was when I was working the polls in St. Louis City in 2020, a veteran came up to me and said, Eric, you seem really passionate about this stuff. You should do something to get more veterans involved. And that was the idea that became Veterans for Political Innovation.
Wow. Yeah, we certainly want to touch on the Veterans for Political Innovation, but I want to go back real quick if I can. Um, you said you never really found yourself really involved in one political party or the other, even at a young age. And I've told this story multiple times, and I know plenty of people that are kind of in this space now that at one point ended up in kind of those echo chambers and those bubbles on the left or the right. For me, it was the Republican Party, full on voting Team Trump in 2016 before I realized kind of what was really going on and was exposed to more information. So, what about you do you think kept you out of those bubbles throughout your entire journey thus far?
Well, so being fully transparent, my parents were both teachers in Milwaukee. They were proud union members and active Democrats, right?
Okay.
And I think a lot of us as kids, you kind of inherit whatever flavor of household you grow up in, right? But then at some point, whether it's faith or politics or your life mission, every individual has to decide what they believe for themselves, right?
Right.
And what they really want to claim as their own. And for me, grew up with kind of those Democratic roots, went to the Naval Academy, very, very conservative, right?
Right.
I came to faith shortly after the Naval Academy. So on some issues, that made me a little more conservative as well, right? But and then so if you go issue by issue, on some I would look like a Democrat, some I'd look like a Republican. But like most independents, I care so much more about the person than I do about this gigantic platform of what they say they stand for. And in reality, what they do is something completely different.
Well, that's good to hear, and it gives me hope that like my kids, will be able to grow up and kind of find their own path and not only do what we do or only fall into one bubble and one pathway.
Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of that stigma with the military, right? Is it's all conservative, meatheads, jarheads who love guns and love the Second Amendment and will end up in a militia at some point or something. Those stupid, simplistic views. But you're saying 50% of veterans kind of fall into this middle area.
Yes, which is one of the reasons why Veterans for Political Innovation exists, right? You
Right.
have close to 50% of veterans don't affiliate with either major party. And in 10 states, they can't even vote in their own primary election that they pay for. Taxpayer funded primary elections in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Nevada, up until we change that very soon, in Oklahoma. You're telling veterans who serve their country, unless you affiliate with a private political party, you don't get to vote in the primary election that you pay for. That, as you can tell, that gets me really fired up. And if we as Americans, if that doesn't piss you off, then I'm sorry, you care more about your party and your tribe than you really care about this country and doing what's right for veterans.
Wow. Yeah. I want to say Indiana, you have to register for a party as well. So
Every state is different. The two parties love to make things as complicated as possible, right? And it's part of how independents and third parties and new voices kind of get almost completely left out of the equation. So I'm not intimately familiar with Indiana's rules. In some states, Missouri, where I live, it's a semi-open primary. When I go to vote in the first round, which, oh, by the way, reform nerds call this our primary problem in American politics. In 2020, 10% of eligible voters elected 83% of our Congress because districts are so gerrymandered, uncompetitive red or uncompetitive blue districts. The only election that matters is the primary in 83% of our districts. And in Missouri, at least I get to participate, but they say, Eric, do you want the Republican ballot or the Democratic ballot? Well, hold on a second. Do the ballots belong to private political parties, or do the ballots belong to we the people who
Right.
pay to have those ballots printed? So that's the thing we're trying to raise awareness on, is there's these structural defects in our system that don't allow everyone to fully participate.
Right. And you mentioned kind of a stat there, and I found some great ones, these points I love from your website. I like to list those out here. One is, says the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index ranks the United States democracy 25th in the world, labeling our nation a flawed democracy.
Yes.
And then, I think you mentioned this with this other point at another podcast I watched. The 116th Congress had a near record low 15% approval rating, yet 95% of its members were reelected in the last election.
Yes. Yes. So, and real quick, Toby, I hope for my conservative friends, once or twice a week, will correct me. Eric, we're not a democracy. Yes, thank you. And I went to law school. I know we're a constitutional republic.
Uh-huh.
Some of us call it a representative democracy, or shorthand, or republic, right? I know, Toby, I know you know that, but for some of your listeners, if they're more conservative, it might turn them off that,
True.
And that's one of the weird things about where we are as a country is my Democratic friends love the term democracy. My Republican friends love the term republic. And we even want to fight over these words.
Right.
But to your point, yes, the Economic Intelligence Unit, we've actually been downgraded to 26th in the world, on par with Chile and Estonia for the world's strength of our democratic republic. And that's very, very concerning. And yet we continue to reelect the same people over and over again, because guess what? 83% of our districts are not really competitive. And that's the problem. It's the lack of real competition is what's killing American democracy.
And I think I've heard you describe this before as well, where it comes down, those numbers boil down to kind of like if you think about the NFL or a football season,
yes.
Where the major national election is like the Super Bowl. The primaries are more like the regular season, but none of us are participating in it.
Or more like the preseason.
Okay, yeah.
So, and I love when I'm giving this presentation at colleges or at high schools, I'll ask, who watches NFL football? And let's say, 15 people in the room raise their hand. Who watches the preseason? It goes down to one or two people. No one does. So what if in the NFL, whoever won the preseason automatically goes to the Super Bowl, and every year it's the same two teams, and people in November go, why do I have such terrible choices? Well, the real competition already took place when no one was watching.
Right. And so that's a diagnosis of some of the problems. And so that's where VPI comes in to solve those key issues. So talk about some of those big things that you guys have going on with like open primaries and voting choices.
Yeah, so at Veterans for Political Innovation, we will only focus on advocating for open primary elections, open nonpartisan primary elections. Again, that's the first round of voting, which most Americans don't even know what a primary is. That's okay. 80 to 90% of Americans don't participate in it, right? But we want those to be fully open. We want all candidates on one ballot, regardless of party, and everyone gets to vote regardless of their party affiliation, on everyone. And then what we advocate for is something called a top 4 or final 5 open primary. So the top 4 or 5 candidates, regardless of party, go to November, and you get to use something called instant runoff voting, which, oh, by the way, if Georgia had instant runoff voting right now, anyone listening in Georgia, you would save your state $75 million just for this runoff election alone, not to mention the one 2 years ago, and how much more money is being spent by, independent expenditures and PACs and just pouring money into that. They might as well be lighting that on fire, because what do we, the people, get for this kind of toxic, kind of negative runoff election, right?
Right. Yeah, and you kind of jumped ahead to one of my other questions. I was going to ask you about that instant runoff voting. I think I saw a post you put maybe on LinkedIn, that I think the news story you even linked to may have said up to $1 billion it's going to cost Georgia, in all the political costs for this
Well,
two Senates runoffs, something like that, right?
that was actually, I think, in one county in Georgia, because so it's 75 million to administer the election statewide. I got that from a very conservative Georgia former state rep, who is working to bring instant runoff voting to Georgia, because he sees this as common sense, conservative principle to save our state money when there's a simple solution to fix it.
And so talk about that. What is instant runoff voting? What does that look like and how does it work?
Right. So it requires something, and I'm intentionally referring to this as instant runoff voting. It requires a ranked ballot, sometimes called ranked choice voting. Technically, instant runoff is one form of ranked choice voting. Unfortunately, Toby, and this is another reason we exist as Veterans for Political Innovation, there is no evidence whatsoever that ranked choice / instant runoff voting benefits one party over the other. There's literally zero evidence that it will make red states blue and blue states red. But we have bad actors, unfortunately, more on one side than the other, saying ranked choice voting is just a tool of George Soros to make our red states blue, and they're starting to ban it. Based
Really?
based completely on fear and misinformation, right? But the way it works is it just gives the voters more choices. In a top 4 runoff like Alaska is using now, right? You get to rank your candidates 1 to 4. The voter can choose to just vote for one. Ireland has had this for over 100 years. They call it the single transferable vote, because your rankings are your vote in each round of the runoff, of the instant runoff, right? So if your first choice finishes last and no one gets over 50% of the first place votes, then there's an instant runoff. Your vote will get transferred to your second choice until someone's over 50%. It gives voters more choices to express more preferences. It rewards problem solvers, consensus builders, and it will make Congress work better for all of us again.
So in the case of, let's see, it's in Georgia, we have one of them is Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock, and I think there's a libertarian candidate who was in the original election as well.
Yes.
And so you're saying if, say, I had voted for Warnock first, but second was Herschel Walker, then in this instant runoff, my vote for Herschel Walker would now count, and anyone else's where he was in their second vote.
Yes, exactly. And the most likely scenario, Toby, right, is it's really going to come down to the 2 to 3% of Georgians who voted for the libertarian candidate. Who would they have picked as their second choice?
Right.
And if they could have expressed that second choice on November 8th, this would be over. And everyone in Georgia, how nice would that be to not have 4 weeks of negative attack ads, just the most poisonous, right? Like I don't even want my kids listening because they're so ridiculous.
Right. Right. And you probably saw a couple of days ago Trump's 2024 announcement, which was tough to watch. It took a long time for him to actually get to the point. But before that, of course, he was already campaigning for Herschel Walker, and that's a great guy. You got to go vote for him. And so, yeah, it began immediately.
Yeah, we don't care about character anymore, right? We want to see the other team lose, right? I mean, it's toxic tribalism, it's poisonous partisanship, And for all my friends who are kind of stuck in that, like, they're the problem. The other side is all the problem. And that's why we must elect my side, right? We need to stop, right? We need to stop, and stop tearing each other apart, stop dehumanizing each other over politics. Families should not be torn apart over politics, or friendships for that matter, right? Like, we can be better. We can be better than this system that's so broken and so toxic.
Yeah. And the one of the biggest problems with all of that is that those extremes are maybe what 5-10% of each side. And
Yep.
then that what that leaves is we're all mostly human beings and Americans that would actually mostly agree on a lot of things in most issues, and when problems come up, and we just don't know it because
Yes.
we're team blue or team red, and we
Right.
never want to have those conversations.
Absolutely. And that goes back to the primary problem I mentioned earlier, right?
Yeah,
So one of the challenges with our work with Veterans for Political Innovation, mobilizing veterans to be trusted messengers for open primaries and voting innovations like ranked choice or instant runoff. That's all we do, right? But
yeah,
for your average person trying to make ends meet in the grocery store, Eric, why should I care about an open primary? Eric, why should I care about instant runoff voting, right? But so we need to connect the dots. Like, do you think Congress is doing a good job? Most people would say no. Do you think the system is broken? Most people would say yes. Then the problem is both parties present dishonest solutions, quote unquote solutions. They're not real solutions. One side says, well, we just need to turn out, we need more voters. It needs to be easier to vote. The other side talks about, election integrity and, whatever their pet causes, but it's not going to solve the underlying problem, which is that 60 to 70% of Americans don't feel well represented, don't feel like we have a real choice, and that's because of partisan primary elections, the low turnout preseason that already picks your winners and losers, and we get to November 8th and we're like, why are my choices so bad?
right. And that case in point, when I went to the my local election office here in November in Indiana, I knew even when I voted Libertarian that this is Indiana, it's a red state, and most of the time the Republican was going to win anyway. And I did not have really that ranked choice voting option. Well, I didn't have it at all, and so my vote essentially then would not matter
Yep.
in a lot of those scenarios. A lot of those, it was Congress members, U.S. House and Senate, but it was local Indiana representation, and even my town council and the school board.
Yeah.
All work the same way.
Right. And so, let's have a system where you can pick a libertarian as your first choice, but then you can express a second choice if you want to. You don't have to,
Right.
right? But that way you would at least be counted. And now the winner, the beautiful thing about instant runoff is the winner does have to win with a majority, right? Whereas now we
Right.
have so many representatives that are elected in a plurality, right? In their primary election, they won a three-way or a five-way race with 30 or 40% of the primary voters. And then there's no real competition in November in their district. And they're supposed to be a quote unquote representative for everyone. That's the problem we're trying to solve.
Right. And so, tell us about any success stories you guys have had in endeavors getting these into state law. Like I think one of them you may have mentioned a minute ago in Nevada.
Yeah. Nevada, we're very excited about. We helped pass a ballot amendment for the top 5 open primary and instant runoff voting. We will have to pass that ballot amendment again in 2024 in order to amend Nevada's constitution. You have to pass it twice.
Mhm.
But we're very excited. Nevada voters came out. They said yes on ballot question 3 in spite of opposition from both major parties
Huh.
and leaders inside of both parties. Just, and this is what we're up against, right? Is the media is controlled by the duopoly. Social media largely is completely divided. And so when we're out there really fighting for the people to give people more choices, both parties are trying to turn this into a partisan football and make us out to be the enemy. And man, when both major parties oppose something, we think it must be a pretty darn good idea.
Right. It kind of tells you the story of of what you should look at and vote for.
Yeah.
How does that actually work? How do you end up getting that on the ballot then in Nevada, especially when both parties opposed it? Like I'm a geek, so I would listen to the all the details, like who you talk to, what paper you filled out, but maybe at a high level, like how does that actually work? And
Yeah.
when
So, real high level, about half of our states have the citizens initiative process, and about half of our states don't. Right? So, that's the first question. Can I even amend my state's constitution by petition? In Nevada, they can. Every state has a different amount of different requirements for the process, right? But normally it starts with you hire attorneys to draft the language, the petition language. You file it with the Secretary of State, and then the Secretary of State approves the final language that you go out with clipboards all over the state, and you have to get a certain number of signatures.
okay,
In Missouri, where I live, it's about 180,000 signatures. In Nevada, it was about 140,000 signatures were needed. We turned in over 240,000 signatures in June to get it on the ballot for November. And then now the citizens get to vote. Some states, it's just 50, you just need 50 plus one, a majority to pass. That's Nevada. In Florida, where in 2020 we ran a campaign for open primaries via constitutional ballot amendment in Florida, you need 60% to pass it. It got 57% of the vote said, yes, we
wow,
want open primaries in Florida. But guess what happened the last 2 weeks of the campaign? Big people inside of both parties came out against open primaries and said, you need to affiliate. We don't want Democrats voting for Republicans and vice versa. Well, guess what? Your private political parties, you don't get to decide who participates in public elections. That's what we want to hammer home. And that's why
yeah.
we know we're fighting for we the people and not we the parties.
And you mentioned a second ago how you said both parties kind of fight against this, but actually one more than the other. And I kind of was surprised to hear you say it's more the Republican Party and the conspiracy theorists who say it's like George Soros led activity to suppress votes, and so that's true then. It's more the Republican Party who's about vote
Well,
integrity.
the momentum against ranked choice voting right now is more in red states.
Wow.
It's been banned. Governor DeSantis in Florida banned the use of ranked choice voting on the local level, even though I thought back in the day conservatives used to believe in local control,
Yeah.
right? And the city of Sarasota passed ranked choice voting in 2007, and the state of Florida has done everything it can to oppose the will of the people in Sarasota since 2007. And somehow he's supposed to be a champion for the people, right? So that's in red states. But now I'm an equal opportunity offender in Nevada, which is much more of a blue state. It was the Democratic Party, the governor who lost came out. Everyone on the top of the Democratic ticket came out against ballot question 3. They were saying things like, it's too complicated and our voters won't understand how to use it. Wow, I thought you believed in really like raising up people from all different backgrounds on a level playing field and giving
Yeah.
new voices a chance. But no, I mean, that's where the hypocrisy of both parties is just never ending.
Yeah, and that's actually a question I had to play kind of a devil's advocate to ranked choice voting and the final five voting. I was going to ask you if you thought it was simple enough to win national adoption, because we already have claims that voting systems are compromised. How do we avoid those claims when the process is, far more complex? I think I watched a video linked from your website that kind of explains how it works. And it's like, I'm geeky enough to start thinking about how do you build literally the software that does that, and or start creating the printed ballots, and
Right.
are people gonna, yeah, so you're saying voters already succumbed. Well, they actually passed it, so, but some I'm sure succumb to that idea that it's too complicated.
Well,
They from their elected official that told them it was too complicated.
right. And look, and we like to say we rank choices all the time, right? We have 27 different types of ketchup at the grocery store. If my number one choice is not available, I know how to look for my second choice, right? We do it
Yeah.
intuitively all the time. It's a Scantron sheet with 5 bubbles in Nevada is what it, right? And you
Okay.
literally just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's super easy. And then as far as like the whole election integrity thing, look, Ireland has used single transferable vote, which is a form of ranked choice voting, for 100 years. They count the ballots by hand. For my friends who want hand counting because they don't trust technology, my same friends who do all their banking on their iPhones, right? We can do this by hand. Ireland's done it for
That's
100
a good
years,
point.
and it's really easy. 82% of Alaskans said it was very simple after using it. And in New York City, same thing. The polling, it's around 75 to 80% said very simple to use.
Okay. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Those who complain about needing a paper ballot sitting there with their iPhone or their Android and all their
Transferring
secure
money or
information. Yeah.
buying Bitcoins.
Right. Buying what was it, SFF or SFT, whatever just failed and went defunct.
Right. So
Right.
we need to ask ourselves questions like, am I right being consistent with what I'm say I believe? We regurgitate all these talking points from the duopoly, from the media that just can't breaks everything down into, well, you're either this or that. You can't be both. Right. And we as people, if we would just step back and be independent thinkers and ask now, wait a minute, is that I talk about election integrity and, you know, but do I use technology every day in ways that I don't know exactly how everything works and I'm okay with that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
yes, our elections should absolutely be safe and secure. And guess what? They are. Our elections are safe and secure, you know?
Right. Right. I don't know if you caught the 2000 Mules movie by Dinesh Souza or any of that. It was this, whole big claim and conspiracy that of how the 2020 election was stolen, using
Right,
2000 Mules.
right.
I had talked to Isaac Saul, who has a newsletter called Tangle. He's a great daily newsletter on any kind of issue where he gives right and left perspectives. And he had written a big newsletter on it. We talked about it and how essentially conspiracy theories like that can be born, and how you can just think of something simple that says, do you think 2,000 to 50,000 people, somebody wouldn't have said something, somebody wouldn't have broke and told their friend, or, it's just so
Yeah.
silly when you start thinking about nuance like that.
Yeah, right. The level of buy-in, right, for some of these,
Yeah.
and then it's like conspiracy on top of conspiracy on top of conspiracy, and it's challenging, right? And I engage with people from all over the political spectrum, and certainly we need to be curious about our government and does the government abuse its power from time to time? Absolutely, right?
Right.
Are there bureaucrats who go way past the authority that they were given by Congress? Absolutely, yes. But that's something completely different. It's, we talk about retail fraud versus wholesale fraud. Retail fraud of one or two people going in and voting, you know, in a district where they no longer live or whatever, that does happen, yes. But wholesale on the level of what was being put forward in 2020, it just wasn't there, right? And how many courts have to say there's no evidence here, there's nothing legitimate here, there's nothing to see here, and yet we just want to bring it up over and over again. Well, what about this, or what about,
Right.
yeah. So
Yeah, and so many things that we talk about have so much nuance that we miss in this red and blue discussion.
yes,
Something so nuanced like abortion, when you're going to the polls, maybe to your state to make it against the law, or you want to make it legal, maybe your Scantron sheet should be, 5 pages of options. And because of all the nuance involved in that kind of discussion and that kind of decision as a voter.
Sure. Yeah, and if you had 5 choices, even if there were, 2 sentences of explaining those choices, I am confident, and we know this from polling, right? Like the
Right.
most extreme choice on either side, 60 to 70% of Americans would not select the most extreme choice,
Exactly.
right? But in our politics, we have no room for nuance, and we don't, the system itself does not allow for representation for people who are more nuanced, more independent, somewhere in the middle. And by middle, I don't necessarily mean milquetoast moderate. I just mean we don't fit into the rubric of, far right or far left.
Right. Right. 100%. And so tell us in our audience about kind of upcoming events or initiatives that Veterans Political Initiative has going.
Yeah. Thanks for asking, Toby. And I didn't really highlight some of our past wins. We helped advocate for semi-open primaries in Maine. That was the first thing we did while we weren't even officially an organization yet. And that was passed. So Maine was a closed primary state, which disenfranchised probably around 100,000 Maine veterans who couldn't participate in their public primaries, right? So we got that changed. That was implemented via legislation. A really brave state senator named Chloe Maxman was a real champion of that. We brought some veterans. I have a classmate from the Naval Academy who's serving in the Maine state legislature. We're able to get him to be a real advocate for semi-open primaries. We, in Wisconsin, there's bipartisan legislation that will be reintroduced for Final Five voting. We launched Veterans for Political Innovation in Wisconsin in October of 2021 to highlight that 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats introduced the bill for Final Five voting in Wisconsin. 3 of them were veterans. And the way it would work in Wisconsin, it would be only for congressional races, would be this open primary, which again is all candidates on one ballot, regardless of party, in the first round for congressional races. And then the top 5 go into November and you get to rank them. Then we have active campaigns for open primaries in Pennsylvania and Oklahoma right now.
Okay.
Rocky Bleier is a Vietnam veteran, 4-time Super Bowl champion in Pittsburgh. He's the honorary veteran chair of the ballotpa.org. And man, if you want to watch an inspiring video, it's a 3-minute video from Rocky Bleier saying closed primary elections, partisan primary elections are un-American.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll check that out.
And then we're working, hopefully in 4 to 5 more states in 2024 for ballot initiatives. We don't know exactly where yet, but then New York City is going to have a ballot amendment for Final Five voting, and San Diego as well.
Wow.
So
New
kind of
York
all
City,
over.
that's a big one.
Yeah, which can be, positive or negative for depending on where you live, right? I think it's great that a big city is using ranked choice voting already, like New York City. They're only using it inside of their partisan primary election.
Okay.
And like most major cities, New York City is one party rule.
Right.
Which again, our underlying thesis, we're not against one party or the other or for one party or the other. We're for the people. And there's currently about 1.2 or 3 million New Yorkers who don't even get to participate in their own taxpayer-funded primary elections. We think that's wrong.
Yeah, 100%. And, if the will of the people is to then still go bounce back and forth to red and blue,
sure.
Republican president 1 year and 4 years later a Democratic president, then that's then the will of the people. But to date, we don't really know what it is. Yeah.
Yes, and they can express those preferences in an open primary. You can choose.
Right.
I can choose a Republican for mayor and a Democrat for comptroller.
Yeah.
Which as an independent or vice versa, that's often what I want to do, right? I want to vote for the person, not the party. And just real quick, Toby, because this is another thing happening in red states. A lot of red state legislatures are trying to close their primary elections. This is happening in Missouri. I believe Indiana's looking into it. Tennessee, Florida's already closed, but because this is the problem they say they're trying to solve, and I'm putting solve in quotes. We know this happens, right? Both parties play in each other's elections to try to handpick the weakest opponent.
Right.
This last cycle, it was Democrats. They did it up in Michigan. They did it in New Hampshire to try to handpick the weakest opponent. So my partisan friends say, well, that's why we need to close primaries to prevent that from happening. Well, guess what? A closed primary doesn't solve that at all, because you can still, with independent expenditures, dark money, millions of dollars will still be spent. What actually solves the problem is an open primary where everyone's on one ballot. You're not going to spend money on someone you're directly competing against.
Right.
So if the parties would be intellectually honest about the solutions they're proposing, closed primaries are not a real solution. Open primaries are a real solution.
Yeah, that's probably a really important message to get out. So not only do you have to fight to get ranked choice voting into these states, but you're actively fighting, or these states are fighting against you already and trying to close down their primaries and kind of go backwards.
Trying to go backward, right? And thankfully, the bills in Missouri have not passed yet, but there's a couple of state legislators that introduce it over and over again. And look, it's a privacy issue too, right? You're going to tell millions of Missouri voters that you now need to go and register with a private political party in order to vote. That's just not going to go over very well. And it's a bad idea. It doesn't solve any problems.
And on these initiatives where you would get like ranked choice voting through onto a ballot, I think you mentioned in Wisconsin that it wouldn't involve the presidential election, but does it ever involve the presidential election in that state when they're going to the polls every 4 years?
In our ballot initiatives and legislation so far, the answer is no. We don't touch the presidential races because they usually fall under a completely different category of rules that govern the presidential. And frankly, those are a little bit more controlled by the parties, right? It's why we have this strange caucus or primary election process for our presidential, right? Iowa and New Hampshire going first. So the parties would have to adopt these reforms. This is the other irony, Toby, though. Both parties have used ranked choice voting inside of their own party primaries, conventions, or caucuses. Virginia, the Republican Party in Virginia used ranked choice voting to nominate Glenn Youngkin and Maureen Winsome Sears, who went on to win, right? Why did they win? Because the Republican primary didn't nominate the most extreme candidate who would have lost in the general. So it was a really smart, savvy political move. And actually the Democratic Party had used ranked choice voting in Nevada for a similar reason. And yet when it comes to statewide, no, it's going to be too complicated for the voters.
Right. Because then we can't control the message, and then we can't control what's going on.
Exactly.
Right.
Then we can't control the outcomes, right? This is about power and control. And right now, the status quo, it's the path of least resistance. It's so easy to know how to win a crowded primary election, low turnout. We can game that, right? But man, if we have real competition amongst 5 people in November and it's a level playing field, both parties don't want real competition. They just don't.
Yeah, they don't, because then we might have, maybe somebody like the Forward Party who just, I'd say gained prominence, but really they just launched last year. We spoke with Blair Walsingham at the beginning of 2021, I believe, and they were 3 months old, but now it's really gaining steam. And the will of the people might be exercised, and 1 year it may be a third party, actually.
Right. Yeah, there's great, we're hopeful that top 5 voting, top 5 open primaries will empower third parties, minor parties, give them a chance to compete on a level playing field. You still have to nominate good candidates, of course, but the structure, the system itself right now does not allow for new voices. There's also another idea that keeps bubbling up more often. It's called fusion voting.
Hmm.
There's 8 states that have this. Most of them are in the Northeast, but I just learned today Mississippi and Idaho also allow for fusion voting, which is um, 2 different parties can nominate the same person for the general election.
Oh,
And that person is essentially running on 2 different lines, and those votes are fused together. So it might be the Democrat, and let's say there's a moderate party, and the Democrat gets 47% of the Democratic line, and they get 7% of the moderate party line for a 54% majority, and they win. But now that moderate party, that minor party can correctly say, we helped put this person over the finish line. Therefore, this part of your platform, we want you to elevate that because that's what's
oh
important
wow.
to us.
Okay, so that's
So,
another way to start having the will of the people injected into the elections.
yeah, more representation, more choices. Right, in a country of 330 million people, why are we forced to choose between Coke and Pepsi over and
Right.
over and over again? Coke or Pepsi? Coke or Pepsi? What? Where's Fanta? Where's Lucky? Where's Hanson's? Whatever. Why don't they have a chance?
Right. And does that argument not work for the folks that only like Coke or Pepsi, though?
Well, but that's another irony, Toby, right? When the polling for partisans, both partisans inside of both parties really don't like their party either. But it's
That's
this
true.
negative polarization where the fear of the other, the fear of the other getting power is so great that we're just going to keep voting for our team and our tribe, even if we really don't like them.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we should, before we close, we should remind everybody how they can help with the Veterans for Political Innovation. I'm sure you guys take donations, volunteers. Yeah, tell everyone about how they can get
Yes.
involved.
Yeah, thank you. So we are a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit. We do not support or oppose candidates or parties. We only work on the structural reforms that I keep talking about, open
Hmm.
primaries, voting innovations, and the combination which we call Final Five voting. So we're open to veterans and supporters. Two of America's most trusted messengers in polling year after year is veterans, we know, and small business owners. People trust small business owners. So something we like to talk about is corporate political responsibility, right? Like if you own a small business, probably not a good idea to weigh in on the most extreme topics of the day.
Right.
But if you want to be an advocate for nonpartisan reforms and make the system work better for everyone, there's no downside to that. There's only upside. So join it. We have a great website. It's veteransforpoliticalinnovation.org. That's way too long. So v-pi.org will get you to
Okay.
our website, v-pi.org. And we'd love for you to join us in any capacity as a volunteer. This is a state by state based movement because states control 80 to 90% of our election laws. So you have to go through the states. But we're confident that once, 5 to 6 states pass these reforms, one, they're going to be very popular with the people. Two, it will spread to other states.
Mm.
And three, think about this. When you have 5 states with top 5 open primaries, you now have 10 US senators who are operating under a completely different incentive structure where
There
they're
you go.
free to answer to the will of the people, not the will of their party and the party saying, well, you can't talk to that person from the other party, you can't do anything. That's what we have right now, right? Is like if you do something bipartisan, you're going to be primaried next cycle. That's what we're trying to get away from. And once we have 5 states on board, things are going to start getting a lot better in Congress. I'm confident of that.
That's a great point. Yeah, because if you were somebody that wants something like term limits for Congress, and you know they would have to vote for that
Exactly.
themselves, then you're going to need people that will actually listen to your vote. And you can't do that until you start getting in one at a time that will actually, like you said, listen to the will of the people and represent their
Yes.
constituents. Yeah.
Let's put the representation back in representative. And this is my closing, closing argument for the we are working to solve the primary problem that is underneath every other problem that's not being solved in our country.
Mhm.
So yes, there's other big problems we know that we need to solve, right? And people mention other reforms to me all the time, such as term limits, which
Right.
can be used wisely. Campaign finance reform, yes. Independent redistricting commissions, yes. Reforming the way we do presidential primaries, yes. All of the above, we need that. But let's start with changing the incentive structure first, making our representatives responsive to all of us, and then we can implement some of these other reforms.
Fantastic.
So that's our theory of change.
I like it. I like it. We'll ensure we put a link on our show description to your website and a couple of videos you mentioned. Eric Bronner, Veterans for Political Innovation. Thanks so much for joining us on the Unity Now podcast.
Thank you again for having me, Toby. This has been great.
All right. We appreciate it. And we'll see everyone later.